Recording now. Cool. Alrighty, so let's get started. We're citizens with a healthy bay, or for a healthy bay, I should say. We really wanted to have this discussion because we recognize that as environmentalists, we have a really interesting role, not only in the advocacy community, but right now, when our nation is kind of swept up in turmoil over basically our racist founding and the persistent oppression of Black and Brown folks, among other marginalized groups. So we felt that we really had a special role in this to play, that we both want to have a conversation that's really frank and explicit about racial injustice, white supremacy, and Black liberation, but also we recognize environmentalists have not always been the most appropriate when dealing with issues of justice, racial justice specifically. So yeah, we're mostly here because I think we have a lot of work to do as environmentalists, and we've been on a great path. But yeah, and sorry, I think I actually skipped over. Kristin, are you still on here? I don't see you. But oh, okay, cool. I thought you jumped off the call for a second. So okay,
Switch
sorry.
computers.
Okay, that makes sense. So Kristin's gonna introduce herself real quick, and then we'll.
Sure. I'm Kristin Ng. I am the new Port of Tacoma Commissioner. I am the first person of color in that role in 101 years. Thanks, Desiree. I see you. So I sit on the Environment and Tribals Affairs Committee of the Port, and that is something that's our priority, is to establish good relations with the Puyallup Tribe of Indians and its long history here, you know, acknowledging that this is traditionally their ancestral lands. For those of you that are new to the Port is considered the economic engine of Pierce County, supporting over 42,000 jobs and $3 billion in economic activity. I like to think of us, the Port, as the intersection of industry and the environment. And so it is very relevant to our topic today with regards to environment, economic justice, and environmental justice.
Thank you. Sorry I skipped you. So yeah, we're just gonna do a brief overview. So we're starting out this discussion with a background section where we can really kind of lay the groundwork for the rest of our discussion. We're gonna transition into a panelist discussion that's gonna be facilitated by Melissa, and it's gonna have the rest of us acting as panelists. Then we're gonna jump into an audience discussion where we're gonna have folks engage with us more directly, and we'll have some folks come off mute and ask some questions and just share how they're feeling. We really want it to be a community-based experience, so it's not all just about us, it's about all of us coming out of this with a better understanding of our past, present, and future. And then we'll end with, I'm gonna share some resources for you all to help you in your anti-racist work, and we will be sending that out tomorrow in an email as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. So yeah, really wanna do a brief background on Juneteenth. So Juneteenth comes from the fact that after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, when a lot of Black folks and Black slaves were supposed to be free, it took nearly 2.5 years for that message to ring across all of the United States. And so while some Black folks in the North were free, a lot of basically plantation owners who were actually in the North and were in the Northeast actually fled to the South, specifically to Texas. Texas and I think Louisiana predominantly. And a lot of them still had plantations and still had slaves for several years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so what happened on Juneteenth, which was June 19th, 1865, was a Northern general who, I guess the United States was all one country, but there was still the Confederate Army was still around to some extent. Northern generals came from the North into Texas to basically storm all of the plantations and let the slaves know that they were free. And they actually read all of the slaves the Emancipation Proclamation, because a lot of slaves were not able to read because it'd be punishable by death. It was actually on the books for over 100 years. And so why that's important to environmentalists is because we recognize that Black people are not free in America, even with Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation. There's still racial injustices that have been pervasive to this day, which is obviously no surprise to any of us. And right now, it's really relevant with both the dozens of killings of unarmed Black people in the last several weeks, to the thousands that have happened in the last several years, to the tens of thousands that have happened in the last decade. And so we want to recognize that as environmentalists and as folks who are working on climate and environment and water policy and activism, that it's our job to show up for racial justice just as much as it's our job to show up for the environment. So yeah, Melissa's going to take it over, and thank you.
Hey everyone. So I'm just going to talk about some of the early environmental movements. And if I, for some reason, freeze up, can someone just text me? I'm not sure what I can do about it, but okay. So some of the early leaders in the environmental movement in the early 1900s were like Henry David Thoreau, one of the writers who wrote Walden and tried to explain how living simply with and closely to nature is in some ways like to be revered and would give people a way to symbolically become native to the continent. John Muir is famous for his push to get Yosemite National Park made into a national park. He's famous for helping found the Sierra Club, but he had a lot of problems. Some of his writings were really racist, and he was more empathetic and understanding of animals. Like he talked about how bears were shot and should be understood by white people. And Aldo Leopold in some ways expanded his reverential writing about nature and argued that protecting nature is a moral imperative, but also had some problematic writings about race. President Teddy Roosevelt, we all know, was really instrumental to expanding national parks and the national park system. One of the guys that we don't hear about very much because he's kind of, I think, pushed down is a guy named Madison, who wrote a book. It's a very white supremacist book, warning of the decline of Nordic people. His book influenced anti-immigration. Book is part of the library of the alt-right or ultra-right group of people. Roosevelt was friends with him and really admired him, along with a lot of other environmentalists. So this American movement of environmentalism was in some ways founded by some people who were racist, and these ideas have made it through time. As these guys were talking about expanding our moral compass to include animals and nature, they specifically excluded people of color. And so their self-reverence and racism meant that they would want to preserve the species they liked and the lands that they liked to hunt on, but they did nothing for the forms of life that they did not prefer, or the non-white people. And unsurprisingly, just like they wanted to manage lands for their own use, they also wanted to manage people. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, Melissa, I just turned off your video to help with your audio connection. So continue to go, but you're good now.
Okay. Sorry about that. So a lot of these guys were leaders in the eugenics movement as well. And while they were building coalitions to preserve their hunting lands, there were environmental disasters increasingly happening around the country. In the 1930s, there was the Dust Bowl that impacted rural farmers, but didn't really gain a lot of attention until it hit bigger cities. In the 1940s, there was a zinc smelter whose gas got trapped and killed and sickened a third of the town of Donora, Pennsylvania, which was a 14,000 person town. In the 1950s through 70s, there was the Love Canal disaster. In the 50s, the Great Smog in London killed 4,000 people within a few days. Nuclear bomb experiments were happening and making people sick because of radioactive fallout. In the 1960s, there was a huge oil spill off of near Santa Barbara, California. In the 1960s, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring about the problems with pesticides mostly, but also other chemicals. And rivers started to catch on fire in the United States. People recognized the costs of environmental negligence, and the environmental movement grew out of the civil rights movement as people felt they had more agency and came together. But at the same time, the environmental movement was kind of exclusionary. Like Sierra Club's membership increased from hundreds of people to thousands, but their advocacy stayed exclusionary. And there's a poll from 1972 where Sierra Club asked their membership whether they should, quote, concern itself with conservation problems of such special groups as the urban poor and ethnic minorities. 40% of Sierra Club's membership opposed doing that, and only 15% were supportive. Another big environmental group was Greenpeace. They believed that political advocacy and legislation were ineffective and inefficient, and they supported nonviolent direct action. One of the things that happened early on was plugging of US Steel's illegal sewage outfall pipes. But that type of action, just with what we know about the risks that people have when police get involved, is that those actions were less accessible to people. So that brings us to the first Earth Day in the early 70s, when the Clean Water Act, and soon after the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act laws were passed. But those laws did not consider special consideration for communities of color, which were hardest hit. These laws were signed into law by President Nixon, who was pretty racist. And there's lots of indication in his speeches that he thought of environmentalism as a cause for the white majority. So I think that takes us up to where Marquis was going to take over.
Thank you. I think it's really important to both chronicle the people and the ideology that informed the early environmental movement, the conservation movement, I think is a better way to put it, up until, when it became a more grassroots effort. So in the 60s and 70s, we did see a more concerted grassroots effort to pass wide-scale environmental and environmental policies that were based around land and environment. And I think we all kind of recognize that those big major pieces of legislation from the federal government kind of spooked a lot of folks who were anti-regulation. And so what we saw was, starting in the 70s and late 80s, was where Reaganism started to take grip and really privatize a lot of environmental policies. So what some folks refer to that as is it's called the private environmental governance, where anti-regulation, what we kind of think of as conservatives at the time, had a lot of power over America, a lot of political power. And what we were seeing was actually folks who were pro-environment were starting to lose a lot of ground, political ground. And so it kind of spooked a lot of folks who were previously very pro-environment, because there was a large grassroots movement. This kind of grassroots movement kind of went away in a lot of areas because the public narrative had just moved on. And so we saw a lot of environmental protections being outsourced to private entities and business. And so we got a lot of business standards in the 80s and 90s that were more focused around how individuals did their part and how business did their part, but government intervention and oversight fell to the wayside. And a lot of politics and a lot of environmental groups, instead of focusing on grassroots organizing and large marches, kind of moved towards the more efficient strategy of trying to play the political game and trying to lobby Congress and kind of do things more concerted through institutions versus the people. And what we saw was a lot of people of color and Black folks who had been leading a lot of the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of the people we call hippies were completely left out of that equation. And a lot of that came at the expense of our environment. And we haven't seen, a lot of major pieces of environmental legislation on the federal level since, right? So that was a huge issue. And folks in America, especially people of color in America, started to catch wind of this in the 90s. And this is something that Sunrise does a lot of organizing around, is what we call trying to move on from the Reagan alignment and recognizing that to win these major fights to protect our lands and our waters and the people, right? Because people should be the focus of our environmental and climate policy. If we do not have the people who are impacted the most at the center of those policies, then they don't serve anyone, right? If they don't serve our most vulnerable, they don't serve the rest of us. And that's just not how we protect our most vulnerable. So yeah, we're here to discuss, we're here to hear from everyone about how and where environmentalists fell off, and how we can look back to some of our most impactful folks in the movement to get back on track. Alrighty, and so Melissa, take us away.
Hey y'all. So I want to go through the panelists and ask you to go into greater depth about your work, how you address environmental justice, and how it's important to your activism. And then if you can also follow it up with what lessons you think we can draw from Juneteenth and the fight for Black liberation to make the environmental movement more equitable. So it's a two-part question. Let's see, Dorian, do you want to go first? We can't hear you.
No, actually, I would say someone else should go. Give me more time to think about the questions.
Okay, sorry.
No problem.
Marquis, I know you've thought about this. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I'm going to deal with just the first question, and I think we can all maybe go through and double back this second.
Okay.
Yeah, my work. I am Citizens for Healthy based climate justice community organizer. I got my start in activism and organizing. Actually, funny enough, with Amnesty International, I came in from a human rights lens. I was me and some of my peers at Western Washington University almost 4 years ago now. We started the student chapter, which we called Western Amnesty, because we recognized that there was an unprecedented rising in America in 2015 and 2016 of really anti-people policies, anti-intellectualism, just a lot of things that are really scary to our democracy and our functioning. Eventually, as I moved along my college career, I got more involved in environmentalism because I really recognized that you can't focus on human rights if you don't focus on the environment that will most disproportionately have the effects of the climate crisis fall on Black, brown, and poor bodies and poor folks. So that got me into environmentalism. I've been doing environmental organizing now for 3 years, and I think environmental justice is important to my activism personally, because I don't want to be the person that's tone deaf and that's looking to policies that don't benefit the people. And I feel like a lot of folks of color have not felt like they're valued in these spaces. I know when I first got into organizing, I didn't feel comfortable like being my full Black self, and I felt like I was constantly watching the words I was using and the phrases I was saying and things like that, and I didn't feel welcomed in these spaces. So once I got my bearings on environmental policy at the state level and the local level, I realized I need to be putting justice at the forefront of that, because for decades it's been left out of the equation. Now I'll just popcorn it to Ryan. Do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, it's a big honor to be with these great colleagues. For our work at the Conservation District, we are not a policy organization and not an advocacy organization per se. We think about ourselves as a implementation organization, implementing conservation on the ground, planting trees, making our water cleaner, preserving our soil. So we're an implementation organization that puts what smart people, scientists, and others who think and study what it's going to take to restore our ecosystems and clean our air and make our salmon prosper, what all those small people say we need to do on the ground to change the landscape in order to protect all these natural resources. So that's what my team and I do every day, and it's a big privilege to do it. With an environmental justice lens, we've been really seriously thinking about our work very differently, especially over the past 5 years. We've brought on very good friends and I think leaders in this work. For those of you that may know, Pat Coleman and Annie Jones Barnes with Coleman and Associates, they're diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants in the South Sound. And they've been with us at the Conservation District doing really intensive work for about the past 4 or 5 years. So we are working our way to think more deeply and intentionally about environmental justice. One area where this is really present for us, because we do so much work in salmon recovery, is with the tribal nations in our service territory. So we have 4 tribal nations in our service territory in Pierce County. One of them that we partner with and work with very closely and very often is the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. And I did want to acknowledge Tribal Council member Annette Bryan, I see is here. I want to acknowledge her and thank her for her leadership and partnership. Salmon recovery, right? So the presence of salmon is absolutely essential to tribal nations' treaty rights. Their right to hunt and gather for cultural reasons and sustenance reasons is absolutely at the core of the Medicine Creek Treaty and their treaty with the United States government. And so without the salmon, we get really nervous about the fate in the future, the case law about their treaty. Not only is it important for legal reasons and enhancing their treaty rights, but it's absolutely essential to their culture and heritage, right? The tribal nations have been here since time immemorial, absolutely the best stewards of the land. And so what we've been reflecting on at the Conservation District for a long time, being a white-led organization, is how does white dominant culture impact the way we go about doing conservation projects with and in partnership with the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, as an example. We need to really bring our, really check ourselves in our pace of the deadlines for the grants and getting the landowner agreements and spending the money and doing this at a white dominant culture pace. It is not necessarily what works for our partners at the Puyallup Nation, as an example. They've been here forever, and our pace may not be their pace. And so we have a lot of work to do. But we are very, very much trying to put our examination of white dominant culture in terms of how we approach our work with tribal nations as an example. And that for us is really one really specific example of our environmental justice journey and our environmental justice work at the Conservation District in action. I can share a bunch of other examples, but I really wanted to start with that one because it's really core to our work and our key partnerships with the Puyallup Nation.
All right, Desiree, do you want to talk about your work and how you address environmental justice and view its importance to your activism?
Sure, I may ask you to repeat the question for me, so my apologies. So it's funny because I've always said that, I always say in these environmental spaces that I'm not an environmentalist, and I tell a joke about how difficult it is to throw away a mustard packet in Seattle because everyone's staring at me. And with this revolution that we are in the midst of, I've really been spending a lot of time thinking about some of the intersections of my work and how important it is to include, when I'm out here consulting with clients up and down the I-5 corridor. That's my new phrase, up and down the I-5 corridor. So when I'm consulting with clients up and down the I-5 corridor about diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial and social justice, I am now talking about sustainability and the environment, and so in addition to sitting on the board of CHB, last year, I had the privilege of teaching some seminars and workshops. I was at Tacoma Community College, University of Puget Sound, University of Washington, Tacoma, and then here recently, I was asked to teach a clinic at University of Washington in their Department of Public Health on racial justice. And so, of course, we talk about how racism is an environmental issue, and I'm sorry, a public health issue. And it's also an environmental issue. So anyway, I've been, in these spaces with students who, have these, I used to think my mind was young and brilliant, but these brilliant young minds, right, that are just, eager to just wrap their hands around understanding some of the systemic barriers that, exist for African-American people, Black people in this country. And so it's just amazing to see them develop. And so anyway, one of the things, I was actually talking to Kristin Cooley today, who works at Tacoma Pierce County Department of Health, talking about Tacoma Roots. And I also was part of the steering committee for Tacoma Roots. And how can we revive that with working with some of those students and letting that be youth-led, let some of the younger POC leaders in the community lead at work, and we support them. So anyway, that's some of the work, the basics of the work that I'm doing from an environmental standpoint. And I'm not an environmentalist. I don't know history. I don't know a lot of the statistics, but I do know justice. I do know social justice and racial justice. And so I try to listen, and as much as I teach and give, I try to receive and learn as well. What was the other question?
The other question was, what lessons can we draw from Juneteenth and the fight for Black liberation to make the environmental movement more equitable?
Oh, that's a big question. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as we, lean into Juneteenth is like how Juneteenth kind of came about, right? Like between the time that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863 and when and Juneteenth happened, when that declaration was read in 1865, that was like 2 years. So what happened within them 2 years? Why it took 2 years? You know what I'm saying? Like those are the types of questions that I think as a community, I want to ask and I want to explore. There's some reports that talk about they were holding off for another cotton harvest, so the masters get one more cotton harvest in, right? And then there was they were scared about a revolution, and then in that time period also, how many Black men enlisted into the army? Right? Like, so why? And there's a essay, oh my God, what is her name? I'm gonna see if I can Google it while I talk. There's an essay, I'll post it later, but there's an accurate, there's an accurate quote about this slave who said, Juneteenth, of course I want to celebrate and that's wonderful, but that's when they told us that we were free. Right, and so that stings a little bit, right? As we look forward to this celebration tomorrow, I'm holding all of those, and I'm holding words like accountability, right? There was no accountability in those 2.5 years, so that's why it was able to last that long. Because how could we, right? Patterns of lack of accountability, right? From even prior to that to now, right? This is a pattern. This is the history of it, and I think that oftentimes we all know this, that white folks can valorize history for their benefit, and so I just hope that some of the brightest minds who are thinking about Juneteenth and thinking about this revolution and thinking about systemic change, that we're asking these deep questions and exploring these deep questions about what happened in them 2.5 years. What happened between the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth? Why? How? So we don't repeat those things. So that's my 2 cents.
Cool, thank you. Kristin, what is your work and how do you address environmental justice and view its importance to your activism?
Sure. Again, I'm Kristin Ng, Port of Tacoma Commissioner. And for me, environmental justice means reconciling with the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. That is the 100-year history conflict of the port since its beginning in 1918, but the Puyallup Tribe has been there since time immemorial. And one time I remember I was at a campaign forum in which the moderator started with, a newspaper said that these lands were desolate until the port took it over. And before I could answer that question, I had to shut that down. I said, the lands have never been desolate. There were stewards there. The Puyallup Tribe were stewards, and it has always been valuable and fruitful, and hence why they were coveted You can't take something. It seems like you make an excuse of why you would take something or more productive when you want it. And, the port has done some good things, but it does need to reconcile this relationship, and it has made it a priority to establish a productive and, a trustful relationship with the Puyallup tribe and Indians. And one of the things I did learn is that the port does put a lot of money, time, and effort into their environmental priorities. But that's also because there was a legacy of contamination of Superfund sites. And, we try to protect water quality, we restore wildlife and habitat. And for the most part, I would say the organization and the staff is about environmental justice and environment. It's just that there is this past that we need to work on. It's not, like we said, it's not enough to be not racist. At this point, if you don't want to perpetuate an injustice, you have to work on anti-racism. Like today, we did have a proclamation at the port recognizing Juneteenth. That is not normally something that the Port of Tacoma does. We usually stick to our core business. But at this point in time in our history, we couldn't be silent. And our staff and our community, our maritime and port community, didn't want us to be either. And I didn't want to either. And yet at the same time, with the importance of Juneteenth, is that I know also the ports and maritime industry is a very white industry. It's a very white male industry. And it's hard for a lot of people to get in there. For instance, I went to a Washington Public Ports Association, and there are 75 ports in Washington with their own commissions, and I only saw one Black commissioner, and he came to give me a hug practically because he saw me. He's like, welcome, thank you for being here. So that one guy is David Simpson, Port of Everett, if you're wondering. He's great. And it's something that we do need to work on. It's not just about words. Like, yes, we're not racist and we support Black Lives Matter. We put it out there. But if we are really dismantling racism, then we really have to talk about economic liberation and who has access to these investments, to these opportunities, who should bear the burden, or nobody. If, let's say, the toxic water contamination was happening in Beverly Hills or someplace in New York, you bet there would be a federal grant right now, federal money's going in there, but it's happening in Flint, Michigan, with a majority minority community, a Black community. When I think about Juneteenth and that Texas was the last one, I also think about economic opportunities going last to the Black community. I think about the cannabis industry, in which imprisoned lots of Black and brown people. And yet now when I speak to some investors and they're talking about it, it's predominantly white people who are going to be the ones investments and in business. When I think about all these different investors and who were there first struggling, it was actually Black and brown people, but who are now going to profit, not them. Who has access to these funds? Who has access to government grants? Who got access to the $500 billion that Congress just passed? I'm telling you, it is not small minority-owned businesses. And I could have guessed that even before it passed, that was going to be the case. And this is where I think the fight is also with Juneteenth. It's freedom, but economic freedom. Liberty, justice, the whole thing. There should be, I'm going to say it, reparations, or some sort of investment, some sort of it just is. When I think about wealth that is compounded through time, if you're ever in finance, about compound interest, how that works, how generational wealth works. And to think that one race was denied all those opportunities, completely robbed or murdered or taken away those opportunities, it just breaks my heart to think about it that way. And there needs to be justice, economic justice. And I think when environmentalism, when I think about the people who started it, the environmental movement, who did they think about who owned these places? Who are these places being preserved for, right? I mean, do you guys remember the Central Park with Ann Cooper and the black guy, Christian Cooper, the bird watcher. Not many people know that, you know, when people think of bird watchers, do they think black guy, Audubon? When I go to environmental organizations, I don't see that many black people or brown people in them at all. And then when I think of where the investments go and who are investing in environmental tech, where are we putting our investments? Well, who can afford a Tesla? I mean, I'm grateful for them. And then when we think about just transitions, sometimes Black and brown communities and people are working jobs that are in fossil fuels and wiping it out without giving them some investments or transitions or training to go somewhere else. That is also an injustice. When telling people like, oh, well, we've got ours, we've built this industry based on fuels, but now you got to do it with something else. Well, then they need support and they need investments. And I think that is, for me, something we should work on.
Thank you.
I'll stop rambling now.
Dorian, so back to you. What is your work? How do you address environmental justice and view its importance in your activism?
Thank you. You know, so like I mentioned, I'm the government relations director for King County Solid Waste. The county solid waste system is probably the country's 6th or 7th largest waste system, and actually we are actively working to try to throw away less tonnage. Essentially, you know, our goal is to essentially go out of the garbage business and fully rely on again the actual recycling business. You know, so I actually interact with elected officials throughout not just King County, but the Puget Sound region and also across the country any given day. One example of justice that I see is totally unforming is that, so, you know, persons know that King County is very culturally diverse, but when you look at where the actual various cultural groups are at, they are heavily in South King County, especially the actual Black population. I was reading an actual Seattle Times article just yesterday that said that Seattle's Black population hasn't drastically changed in coming from an actual percentage standpoint in 10 years. It's just Seattle as a city has grown drastically. But along with that, we are seeing cities in South King County, as well as Tacoma and Pierce County, are becoming more and more diverse, but their actual needs, as again, Black people, are not being met because these actual communities have never had to truly address their own systems of inequity. One of the most common conversations I have is, you know, we constantly have reports of like, you know, small builders and also, you know, so-called customers literally driving from places like Kirkland, Issaquah, and Bellevue, and driving down as far as Tacoma just to actually illegally dump. And I don't mean illegally dump in Proctor. I mean illegally dumping off of in Portland Avenue. So these persons will go clear across a full county just to actually illegally dump, and again, communities who are historically underserved. And so in a lot of ways, it's actually a fight to hold those other persons accountable, but also work within these actual solid waste systems to give equal access to all, you know, customers as well. We do offer services to like seniors and also lower income households. However, a target of mine with my work is that, as again, as a whole, the actual solid waste industry is all about the actual bottom line. And so essentially, you know, hiring Black employees are again an issue. I'm actually a cultural unicorn. I mean, I'm like the Black person in almost every single meeting, whether or not it is at the county level or essentially a regional level or even a private sector level, wherein Black persons are not considered as again part of the actual conversation going on. Along with that, like I said, I went to school to be, an actual urban planner, and I did so because, I was thinking about it. I'm originally from Cincinnati, and we of course, we actually lived in the projects, and we lived across the street from an actual steel plant. And as a kid, I never really thought about it, but that is a clear inequity issue. You have people living literally across the street from heavy industrial plants. Who knows what kind of health issues were actually generated from those persons like me who literally played outside right across the street and seeing trucks come and go, kicking up dust and also other particles and so on. It's at the actual end of the day, when again me as a people were actually brought here as again property, that's how our actual existence is still viewed. We are still property. And again, a person can say, well, no, slavery's over. Well, look, we're not considered equal in every action that this American democracy actually plays out. It's like at the end of the day, our actual rights, our actual needs are again only brought to the forefront when again someone is caught. We are not considered as being part of until someone is caught, sued, and are also killed. And so for me, the work I do as my actual day job, and also here in the actual city of Tacoma, is just making sure that our actual voice stays up front and center, even if it's just me within a crowd or again at any given meeting. Juneteenth, that's the question. So, I've always heard of Juneteenth. I've gone to churches where we actually celebrate and so forth. But it's amazing to see how many persons, even to this day, were totally unaware of it. Like, for instance, a lot of persons aren't aware that 46 out of the actual 50 states officially recognize Juneteenth, but don't actually openly celebrate it. Something tells me that tomorrow is going to be different. But that's just another example that is a part of American history that people don't think about until a shock to the actual system. Like I said, it goes. Yeah, it's a lot. It's just a lot knowing that your story is not being told unless the actual cultural majority feels a need to actually pay attention to it. So in a lot of ways, it is a constant fight. It is a constant struggle, and in a lot of ways, I just want to be. I don't want to have to be that one to actually point out issues and so forth. But I guess that's what I'm here to do then. So that's all I have for now. Thank
you, Dorian. So right now we're at 5:53, and this is scheduled to end at 6:30. And so I just want to give a time check that we have about 37 minutes, and we have quite a few questions, and then we also want to give time for audience questions and discussion. So what I'll do next with this next part is ask one of the questions that we've come up with, and whichever panelists want to answer it, I'm going to let you jump in and fight for it. So The first question is, what role does white fragility play in environmental politics? And if you don't mind just explaining white fragility right off the bat, and I can see that Dorian wants to jump in.
Oh, no. I'm just really looking forward to seeing what everyone says. That's all.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'm eager and willing. Yeah, so white fragility is the concept that conversations of race, and also I think this extends to conversations of class and some of the multiple systems of power and oppression that relate into race. So conversations of race are particularly hard for white folks to have because there is oppression is implicit in your identity as a white person. It's just how it is. As a biracial mixed race person, I have, light skin privilege. We all have forms of privilege, and specifically white privilege is really hard for white folks to talk about because there's a lot of well-intended white folks who do not understand that their identity is part of a larger system that leads to folks like me and the rest of the panelists getting killed by police. So I think how white fragility plays in the environmental movement is, I think on a lot of nonprofits, specifically, I know sometimes with board composition that can be an issue where a lot of boards don't want to deal with intersectional policies that tie into like environmental justice and racial justice because for hundreds of years, all of us, but specifically white folks, have been programmed to not talk about race. And we've been indoctrinated to think that it's actually impolite and it's improper to bring up some of these things and that they need to be left in the past. And that's how we move on from racism. What I would hope all of us on this call recognize is anti-racism is important to every conversation we're having, not just conversations about race. And so I think white fragility comes into play here because it's just uncomfortable. It's just really uncomfortable for folks to look in the mirror and recognize that they have privilege and that their existence leads to the oppression of others. And it's a really heavy topic and it's really uncomfortable and we're not trained to deal with it. So we avoid it instead. And I feel like I rambled, so cutting myself off.
Thank you, Marquis. Do any of the other panelists want to add to that?
I would love to hear the non-Black panelists share how they actually see it, because I'm sure we as Black people, I can tell you everything that we know, but I would love to hear others say it as well.
I'm going to co-sign on Dorian
Exactly.
because I actually had a reaction when the question was asked, and the reaction was Google it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Yeah, that's thoughtful. And Ryan, do you want to offer a thought?
Yeah, it's an incredibly important topic to explore as white people in order for white people to be better allies to begin with and better allies. I think it's an absolute essential concept. As I go about my life, my professional life, my personal life, especially now during this moment in our history. Granted, I have the time and the privilege to work on DEI issues. My organization carves out real time, so I get to wrestle with the topic of white fragility. A lot of people who I interact with don't, and so I guess I always have to remember that other people's life, who they get to interact with, their life experience, they don't get to wrestle with that. So that's of course we continue to hear a lot of white people saying, I wasn't a slave owner, I'm not responsible for that. It's 2020. Why, I wasn't responsible for that. I mean, that kind of narrative is alive and well, right? And is at the heart of not understanding, I think, the difference about being not good enough to just be not racist, but anti-racism. I'm reflecting in this moment in time about what it means to be a better ally, what it means to be in allyship. I've worked in LGBTQ civil rights work for a lot of my life, and I've in that space really have grown to understand the power and the importance of allyship and intersectionality. And I'm really trying to transition my thinking from those experiences to really centering it on race and racism. One last thing I will say about white fragility, especially when white folks are beginning to work on their issues of internalized racism and racism in general, is I've come to learn that a lot of white folks want to talk about something else, right? Talk about, well, I'm LGBT, therefore I know what it's like to be oppressed, or I'm a woman, or yes, there's lots of oppression. And we have a lot of work to do on racism and not divert the conversation to other kinds of isms in my mind. And I see that showing up in real white fragility every day as a scapegoat, a way to change the conversation.
And I think in addition to changing the narrative, right? Like, and I'm going to say something very just short here. Like historically, right? Like in what was like 1981 or 82, when they tried to build those landfills in, I think it was in North Carolina in Warren County, right? Like Black people protested. Like there was actually like organized radical movement happening in environmental justice. Yes, but intersectionality is not yours. But anyway, and I want to know why it failed. Like I haven't done in-depth research, but right, like so white fragility is one thing, but within white fragility, there should be an examination of behaviors. There should be an examination of thought process. There should be an examination of awareness, right? So it's not really for me to talk about white fragility. It's really for my white counterparts and my white peers to talk about white fragility and examine historically what happened in the environmental movement, specifically with Black and Brown people, specifically in Black and Brown communities. And you all examine and talk about why things happen. And you all create spaces for resources and create spaces for access, or just move out of the way and let great organizations like Tacoma Roots, an environmental organization that was created for us, by us, or by us for us, right? Like that's to me, in addition to what Ryan is saying, there has to be an examination and an awareness as well.
When I think about white fragility, I think about defensiveness as well as when people tell me like, I don't see color. When I hear that, I said, well, then I think you're blind. You're blind to justice issues then, to social issues. I think it's also a sense that they don't want their hands to be connected anyway to the abhorrent slavery, to racism. So, you know, they want their hands to be clean. But if you're not that they could never be perpetuating systemic racism. But if you're not working to dismantle that, you know, our hands are not clean. Like all our hands, like here, not clean if we keep perpetuating and not doing something about it. So when I see it in some of the spaces that I go, he's like, well, I couldn't be possibly racist. Either they have one Black friend or they don't see color. And if you're not, like I said, if you're kind of being ignorant or blind to the injustices of the world. And that's when I think of white fragility, is that you want your hands to be cleaned of it, like a Pontius Pilate, but you're neck deep into it. You're allowing it to happen. So that means you are culpable as well. You may not be like the overt racist and you're not doing lynchings, you're not burning cross, but you're still there, part of this society. And so you should be helping. And I gotta go though. I gotta go to my next Zoom meeting. I've been in a Zoom meeting since 8 o'clock. I'll see ya. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kristin.
You know, also too, just to add to it, to me, at the end of the day, white fragility to me is just that. You're weak. And so essentially a person is just examining their actual weakness. Imagine as a people, you could not tear down and wipe out Black and Brown people's existence from a system that you are designed against them. It showed me that as the actual majority, you are willfully ignorant and weak to your own issues.
Thank you, Dorian. And thank you, Desiree and Ryan. I want to just step out of my moderator role for a second and just say that I think that all of us white environmentalists do have a lot of work to do on this. I have work to do on this. It's hard to not feel defensive and to not want to examine our white privilege. And I think that it takes like practicing humility and examining ourselves and examining our motivations in a really thoughtful and intentional way. And I think everyone's heard about this book so far, but I'm just going to recommend that people pick up White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. It is a really great and practical book. So I will go back to my moderator role.
And can I say one thing to all the persons who actually pick up the book? Please read it for yourself, and please don't ask any Black person if you have read it, or even any other person of color if you have read it. That is the most offensive, ignorant question in the world to ask me if I have read it. Like she's talking to you about my experience. So please, I know you probably mean well, but please don't ask me that, because I've had it in the past, and I have definitely made my fair share of people cry. So please don't ask us that.
Thank you.
Do your work, please. Thanks.
I was about to say before I cracked up into laughter is that if you don't want to read the book, there's also a TED Talk that she did. Just read the book or Google it.
I want a bumper sticker that just says Google it, exclamation point. So the next question is, how do we as environmentalists better align with justice movements and the movement for Black Lives Matter?
I'll take a stab unless anyone wants to jump in. Desiree, got this?
Can you ask that again? No, can you just ask it again?
Yes. How do we as environmentalists, so we're asking you for advice, like how do we as environmentalists better align with justice movements and the movement for Black lives?
So you got the Dorian?
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about a Ludacris song, and I won't actually say the full title, but it starts off with "Move, get out the way." I mean, in short, it's like you have to understand that it's not about you. It is not about you. I understand that, again, you are prone, and I'm saying you for a reason, are prone to co-opt things because you've been trained to own, to actually take over. But if in fact you are actually trying to contribute to a greater movement, know that it's not just for your own well-being, but it's for all persons' well-being. Understand that if you are joined up with Black Lives Matter and so forth, ask them, say, hey, what exactly can I do to actually contribute my experience, knowledge, and access to your actual movement or needs? And also, at the end of the day, if they actually tell you to beat it. It's okay. But at the same time, understand that the only thing that you have a right to own is actual knowledge, not access, is knowledge. And how exactly you can share that knowledge to improve the quality of life for, again, Black persons, especially at this actual moment in time, is crucial. Because again, at the end of the day, if you feel that you are sharing access that you don't have any control over, think about it. You control everything else. So it's something to keep in mind. So I'm done.
Yesterday was Leadership Tomorrow. It's a leadership organization similar to ALF, but it's in Seattle. Was our graduation, and I was one of the speakers. And I wrote it that morning. And what I talked about was the exhaustion that like my mother had when she cried. Like she didn't cry, I'm sorry, when George Floyd was murdered. She didn't cry because she was just so just sad and sorrowful for George and all that. She cried because she was exhausted. You know, the exhaustion that Black people are carrying right now, because there has been we were taught behaviors so that we could do things like this, right? My mother taught me to be mindful of my body language so white people could feel safe. She taught me how to articulate my words a little different than the people that I grew up around in Roseland on the south side of Chicago, so it could be tolerable to you on your palate, right? And so those are behaviors. I've been socialized to be oppressed, right? And so there is an exhaustion that Black people are having as we're in the midst of a revolution where we are tired of being something we are not to make you feel good and make you feel safe and make you feel comfortable. So there's an exhaustion. So my code switching stopped a few years ago. I don't have the energy to code switch. And I played the flute, so I was in fine arts and all of that, being exactly who I am from the south side of Chicago, right? And so my point is that Dorian hit the nail on the head. And I closed my speech with, it's not about having, and I've said this before and I'm gonna continue to say it, it's not about having a bigger table. It's not about having more seats at the table. It's not about you welcoming us into your space. It's about you getting up and relinquishing power and getting out. I'm not gonna cuss because somebody said their baby was watching. And getting out of the way. The exhaustion is because you have been at the table for so long. Go away. Go do something else. My people are a creative people. We are a brilliant people. Even in the midst of oppression, look at the things we've created and built and done. We do not need your direction. You're trying to do modern day colonization. Like, we don't need that. We don't need you to direct us. We don't need to be welcomed into your space. The question should be, how do we welcome you into our space? That's what we should be talking about. So I agree. Move and get out the way. Write a check before you go.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off that. I think, Desiree, we were talking about how your mom cries, and I resonate with that because I think as a Black man, I often recognize I cannot feel a full range of emotions because the way the world is so much, and constantly living with that mask. When I cry, I literally cannot stop crying until I fall asleep. I literally will, once I start crying, I cry the whole damn day. Melissa saw me. I had to send myself home from work because once I get started, I can't stop, because living with a mask, every time I get in a car, I have to constantly check my rearview mirror to make sure I'm not being murdered by a police officer. It's a lot. And so I think that ties directly into what Desiree is saying of it's not, as much as I think white allies should be building power for Black folks, it's really important to allow us to prosper in our roles and allow us to rise so that we can set the table for ourselves. And that goes not only to Black folks, but to all people of color, but specifically we're centering Black folks. And I think it begs repeating, right? Of we want allies, we want folks marching next to us, but we also need folks to get out of our way so we can chart the path forward. And I think to give folks maybe more immediate actions, because I understand getting out of the way is kind of something that it takes a while to wrap your brain around, is people of color need to be centered in every single conversation, every single room, every single policy. And if they're not at the table setting the menu, then we're the first ones eaten. And I think that's something we all got to recognize.
Wow, thank you. I'm just trying to keep aware of time and keep conversation flowing. And so the next thing we were talking about doing is questions. And Marquis, do you mind just explaining what you had in mind for audience questions? Yeah.
So now is a really good time for folks to post questions in the chat. So we're going to start with one of the questions that we got already. And we're actually going to allow folks to, actually, do folks want to come off audio and ask their questions? So James, you maybe want to give your question and we can kind of grapple through it as an entire call versus just the panelists.
Hi, did you call on me?
Yeah.
First, thanks for just everyone's thoughts, especially the panelists. And, going back to the question around white fragility and white privilege, I think oftentimes part of the reflection for white people to do is, really acknowledging how white people are also harmed by racism and really see themselves as a part of this. And it's not something that just impacts Black communities and Asian communities and other communities of color, but it hurts white people when they are quiet and when they're complicit. So part of, I think, my hope for like white allies in seeing themselves as part of this movement is understanding the impacts that racism has on them as well.
Go.
We both gonna say something.
James, help me. How does racism hurt white people?
I think, like, for example, like the opioid epidemic, right? And because the focus was on criminalizing like Black and brown communities for so long, that there wasn't attention. Like it was easy to just cast the blame and direct all the harm to Black communities. But now when it finally impacts white communities, it becomes like suddenly people care about the opioid epidemic when it hurts white communities. So I guess just to give context and clarity, like my comment isn't to try, it's not to center white voices or white actions, but really to highlight that when there is that neglect of Black and brown communities and the racism that is involved with that, it hurts white families as well. I know I'm not articulating it very well, and so I apologize.
And that's okay. I'm going to be honest with you and say that your question is very, very triggering. Okay, and so I'm going to encourage everybody to just take a little bit of a breath. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, James, what I want you to do is, because I think you have I think there's something that you're really trying to wrap your head around, and what I want you to do is partner with someone, partner with a mentor or someone you trust in the community to help you formalize this question and this thought pattern, this rabbit hole that you're going down. So that's the second thing. The third thing, James, is we're in the midst of a revolution, because Black and brown people, specifically Black people, have been caring about how things affect you and the white community for centuries. James, honey, I'm going to say this to you, and I'm going to say this on a platform where I'm sure I'm going to get a call or an email. Nobody cares about how you feel anymore. Because right now, Black lives matter. That's it, and that's all.
And I want to piggyback off that. I think, yeah, it kind of harkens back to this concept of we're not all free. We're not free until all of us are free, but it's still like we have to center Black voices. And James, I think we get what you're getting at, but I do agree that the framing can be really triggering for folks who are seeing ourselves murdered, right? And we're like, well, why do white people need to be centered? But what you're hearkening to is true, that like to oppress someone is inflicting violence on you and yourself and your children, but the violence is inflicted onto our bodies, right? And so there is a disconnect there. But I think that's really important, right? Is the impact versus intent, I think, is something that we have to really consider.
Next audience question. I need a little bit of help to figure out. It looks like there's been a couple that have come in.
I will help you, Melissa. I think there's been a lot of talk about the last question, but I see a new question is, what non-white environmental voices are people listening to right now?
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody else want to jump in? I guess I'll just really quick. So this is kind of more in the framing of like a just transition to Green New Deal, but Rihanna Gunwright, who was one of the lead architects of the Green New Deal, the way she talks about how to win environmental fights and to win fights of reducing, our parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, we have to center racial and economic justice, and that we cannot win without a unified front. And so the Years Project has some really good videos on the Green New Deal that talks about why racial and economic justice needs to be at the center of all of our environmental and climate policies. And as an environmentalist, it's really helpful for me because it allows me to connect what are two different parts of my brain, right? Because there's my Black liberation brain and my colonized brain that where a lot of my environmentalism lives, and helps me connect those two parts. So I would recommend the Years Project and Rihanna and the videos that she puts out that connect environmental justice and climate justice with racial justice and social justice.
I agree.
One of the concepts that brings up for me, Marquis, and others, is about the same kinds of systems that are oppressing Black and brown people are the same major oppressions that have contributed to the climate crisis. And I'm for this conversation about environmental justice being intertwined with racial justice, the same folks who are polluting, the same people who are causing who have a lot of money to gain in order to keep their white power and to keep the table the way the table is set, and the menu, that whole metaphor, are the financial institutions, the banks, the energy companies, the Fortune 500 companies are the same ones that are oppressing Black and brown people and have been for generations. I think that's something for all of us, white folks and people of color, to unpack as well, in order to understand some of the same kinds of oppressors.
Do we have a next question?
I'm not sure if we have one in the chat. Does anybody want to jump in and just come off mute? We recognize this is a safe space, and if we're not all learning from this, if we're not all being honest and transparent, then we're not getting everything we want to. So if anybody wants to jump in, take themselves off mute, and ask a question real quick, we can try to answer that before we move on.
I wanted to just say to James that, James, I put a little message to you in the chat. James Honk, I put a little message to you in the chat box. I hope you can see it.
I have a question. I feel like in my organization and in other organizations that I partner with, a lot of the focus on how we're writing our grants and our programs that we're focusing on are bringing our programming to communities of color. And I want to know, is that an imposition, or is that imposing, or is that what we should be focusing on still? Because that's, since I've been in the movement, has been a lot of what is being talked about.
I would actually, and I'm putting on my consulting hat and thinking about strategic planning. The first thing I want to know is, are there any African American people on staff and leadership and on your board? Because that's where the conversation starts.
And also, I would say, since this is a conversation about Black people in Juneteenth, you also have to unpack the actual language that you use. Like, for instance, you mentioned the communities of color. Well, who?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, it is in some way, because I used to write grants, man, that was a long time ago, but I used to write grants, and so these organizations have to be very intentional about who they are trying to target, and as Desiree said, I mean, it starts internally. You can actually go and well about we're going to apply for this funding to help out this group of people who we haven't even talked to, or also don't have a well-grounded understanding, or in some ways able to share their actual knowledge with our actual a desire to improve quality of life. So in some way, you have to connect what you are seeing as a need with what this group is actually in need of. And like I said, oh, what?
Go ahead.
Yeah, and like I said, it's key to have those conversations externally and internally. And again, I mean, you know, it's key to use very specific language and intent, because essentially put, I'm not going to tell you about how you should apply for a grant that is actually targeting the actual Hmong population in East and South Tacoma. Just like I wouldn't want anyone from that actual community to tell you how to write and target grants for me. So.
Yeah, and in addition to that, and I'll be quick. So I sit on the board of the Tacoma Symphony, and there was a desire to, how do you bring music back to the community, or you know, whatever the official campaign was, and it was, who are you already authentically in relationship with? The reason why this is also difficult is because you're not naturally in a relationship with Black and brown people, right? It's about who do you sit at your table with and break bread with. If you've never had a Black person even cross the threshold of your home, I digress. So what we did at the symphony is we literally sat down and did a brain dump. It was my brain, but that's okay. We did a collective brain dump of all of the POC organizations in Tacoma that we wanted to partner with. And then we broke up into groups and went to them to just have a conversation about music. It wasn't about how do we welcome you into our space, and it wasn't any of that. It was, let's just have a conversation about music. What does music mean to you in your community? What feels good? How can we support the work that you're doing? It can mean just having a quintet, excuse me, showing up at an event, right? And we've been creating these relationships all across the city because it's just about relationship. It's the authenticity of it, not in a tokenizing way, in a way, and this is what we have. And this is what we want to offer to you if you would like it. We want to know more about what you're doing and how we can support the work that you're doing. Come to the symphony. Here's 15 free tickets for you and your community to come to the symphony and enjoy and be in our space. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's about authentic relationship. And it sounds like from your question, Britt, that y'all might not be an authentic relationship with communities of color.
I should say that I've represented a lot of environmental organizations since I've come to Tacoma, so it's actually like it's kind of across the board. But yes, that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think just one last note on that. I think we've all talked about this. I think the best place to go is to partner. Like, I think I want to recognize and validate that, like, nonprofits and groups need money. They need money to do good work, and they need money to expand their capacity to serve every community, not just the wealthy few. But also, you kind of get into problematic territory. And I think a really healthy way to start is partnerships, right? Hey, like, go to groups and be like, I directly want to share resources and power with you because we have a shared interest in fixing this goddamn mess that's happening outside of these walls. So I think coming from a place of like true partnership and collaboration and listening, I don't think you can go wrong. I mean, I'm sure obviously we don't want to do brain drains. We don't want to take resources from folks who are already doing good work. But I think if we're approaching folks as like, hey, you're doing good work, how can we support each other, and how can we recognize that the climate crisis is not going to be solved by any one group working on it, or environmental degradation or whatever group? I think that's a good, healthy way to start too.
All right, we're at 6:28, and I don't know if we want to ask people to offer a quick, maybe we have time for 2 people to give quick thoughts. Marquis, I'm just looking at you to make sure that's what you had in mind for discussion.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I guess just in closing, I think maybe we could all go around and give one last final thought. I think that'd be good. And before we do that, because I see folks kind of jumping off, me and Maddie are going to be sending around resources. And so we're keeping track of the chat. I have resources already outlined. We've all been listening. So we're going to send out resources tomorrow that are helping folks on their journey with anti-racism and celebrating Black liberation and getting out of the way. So we're going to all go around one time and just say some closing thoughts, but you can all be looking forward to some resources to help folks in their journey and to help us be better in our environmentalism. And so I'll just do my closing thought, and then we can just go around. So I just want to thank folks for tuning in. I recognize that this is a hard ass time, right? This is a time where it's so much is happening. Like every 5 seconds, I feel like folks are like, "Hey, what's this event, or what are you doing, or what's this petition?" And it's really overwhelming. So I think white folks, you need to do this work, and I don't think you need congratulations to do this work, but I do want to validate that it's a lot going on, and that there's a lot of static and noise, and that we're all doing the right work. And whether we stumble or we trip, moving forward and being humble and being graceful in our following, I think, is something that we should all keep in mind. And with that, I will stop talking.
Thanks, Marquis. And are we going around? Is it just the panelists going around? Okay.
Well, I'll go. So just to move us forward, I'm sorry. So I would encourage you all in your organizations, the places where you sit on boards, don't try to do this work on your own. Reach out to consultants. Ryan mentioned Pat and Annie of Coleman and Associates. They do a lot of DEI work. Dorian has a firm that does DEI work, Archway Consulting. I have a firm, riselwp.org, and we're all available to do. And there's enough out here for everybody to get ahead, right? Like, find somebody that's a good fit, and lean into the work, and be prepared for a marathon. It's not a journey. We've been oppressed for centuries. It's gonna take centuries, but the revolution is today.
And I would say that, I can't add a lot more to it, because if you actually came here to hear and ask questions and talk, then you are aware enough to know of the actual potential work that you think you have to do. So I would say keep on doing the work, keep on stumbling, keep on getting cussed out, keep on, because again, at the end of the day, you have existed in a system that you have the privilege of, again, benefiting from. So I will get cussed out 2020. I will actually give you some actual validation to say that you're here. So the work has started. Keep it up, and trust me, along the way, you might not get a helping hand from people who actually look like me, but trust me, we have watched you our entire lives. So keep up the work, and the work never ceases. Thank you.
The only thought that I wanted to leave is a challenge to my fellow white folks. Whether you lead an organization or part of one, whether it's your employment or a civic organization, I think in doing the work, at least for me, I think the challenge needs to be carving out real time, real resources, real financial resources. As Desiree, others mentioned, there are real professional people who help organizations, white people, methodically work through this and give real resources to have the best chance at being anti-racist. And so financial resources, significant time, real significant time, as we all know. This work takes a lot to undo. And so we got to carve out time in our work plans, carve out time in our months, our years, to just really dedicate it. I just wanted to take do the work to just a little bit more granular. Doing the work means carving out real time and resources.
Absolutely.
Preach.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Like Marquis said, he's going to send out resources. Keep in touch with us. Let us know what you think. Let us know about steps in discussion. And we hope to meet up again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.